I think one of the themes as we were sort of organizing this summit and that we wanted to sort of build on was resilience. I think what we've sort of seen in 2025 is political, regulatory pushback, both in the EU, in the US. I think, a bit of confusion also around some regulatory changes for a lot of professionals here in the room, but also just a lot of changes in the world, right? With, new administration in the US, the Ukraine war obviously still raging on, which we will touch upon with Jeff as well. Now presently, which actually obviously we weren't aware of when we started organizing this, the war in the Middle East. And all these things have had implications and ramifications for probably most of the companies here in the room. And I think resilience is really a theme. If you think about sustainability in the longer term, that's what we're all sort of working towards, right? Building businesses that stand sort of different shocks, external shocks, and can manage certain risks, be it environmental, things, climate change, energy prices, but also obviously societal change. So yeah, I think that's ultimately a lot of us are trying to build resilient businesses and trying to to do that in a way that is financially resilient, but then also on other metrics. And why have we invited Jeff to come and speak with us today? So Jeff is Chief Sustainability Officer at DTEK, which is one of the Ukraine's largest private energy companies, and he leads the sustainability team there. And correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers, but you have about 55,000 people
Yeah,
of working at DTEC, operating critical energy infrastructure in the Ukraine and beyond, and obviously now also under the duress of war. So lots to talk about there in terms of resilience. Do you want to say a few words maybe about your background before we go into the different questions that we've prepared? I'd like to take you through just so that everybody knows who you are.
sure. Yeah, thanks. And I think just also thank you to Key History for hosting today. And for myself, I'm a sustainability professional. I've been doing sustainability for close to 20 years. And I actually started in energy at Centrica, so British Gas, for those here in the UK. And it was interesting. I've worked in a few different sectors, and now found myself back in energy. And I was speaking with some of the team earlier at the coffee break, and what brought me back to working for a company like DTEC is the coal transition. So who is DTEC? We are Ukraine's largest private energy company. Our legacy is coal. We have coal mines in throughout the country. Some of those are now occupied by the Russian forces. We also have thermal power generation that we use the coal in. We've got wind farms, solar farms. A few of those are also under occupation. We have a trading business. We have oil and gas. We have a consumer-facing business called Yasno in Ukraine. So we are a big player. We provide around a fifth of the power capacity in Ukraine. And the company has been on a journey for, sorry to use that word, I know it's overused in sustainability circles, but for a while. So think of the DTEC's 20 years old. We had we've been building renewables and running our stations. We're building renewables for about 12, 13 years. But for Ukraine, the war started in 2014. So the company has been going through conflict for 12 years. So a lot of us think about the war from 2022. And since then, it's been a very dramatic change. But yeah, the context that the business has been under has been one of conflict for quite some time. So the theme of resilience is a really important one for us because while there's the broader energy transition topic that we have to go through, and that was what drove me personally of wanting to get involved and support the business. There is also the energy transition has been driven by that kind of idea of decarbonization and addressing climate change. And I think what we'll touch on a little bit today is the fact that the energy transition for DTEC in Ukraine is actually more of a security agenda now. And I think this is where, yeah, maybe handing it back over to you, but that sets a little bit of the stage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So thank you for that introduction. So, like, a lot of companies obviously talk about resilience, but you're operating in the middle of a war. What does resilience look like in practice for DTEK and for your teams on the ground? I know that we have been, on Zoom calls with your team, with folks saying, "I don't have energy today. I don't have any heating." But that's obviously just scratching the surface. What's really happening on the ground?
Yeah, so I think let's think of it in a few different ways. So taking a few different teams that we have. So our power stations and our grids substations are under fire on a daily basis. And so in an evening, some of the power stations will be having over 100 drones kind of confronting them, and also some missiles. And what happens, unfortunately, is those some of those are not destroyed through the preventive measures, and they will hit. And so the teams on those sites are having to work under the most difficult circumstances, and they still show up for work. So to give you context, for this winter was an extremely harsh winter in Ukraine, minus 20 degrees centigrade, and we've got teams that are out having to work in minus 20, having to work through rebel, work through fire, at the same time as emergency services are there. And what they're having to do is clean up sites, rebuild, and in that sense, I think resilience is just showing up for work, and showing up for work under those extreme circumstances. I think also, I think it's not just the front line. We also, so I'm based here in London. I'll be on team calls with my team that are based in Kiev, and they will be completely in darkness, and the only light on their faces is their screen. And that's because they've been living without power for 20 hours a day. And they need to shrink their calls because they need to do their call while they have enough battery in their computer. And in even in those circumstances, people still join the calls. They still show up for work. They will try to get in to cross the river in Kiev to make it into the office because the office has power and has heat. So I think resilience is it means different things, but we see and I see examples of it across every part of the business. Um, I will also just maybe say resilience. I can also look at it in a time frame. So like right now, the business is focused on keeping the lights on, and that means repairing coal stations. And to go throughout Europe and ask for money to rebuild a coal station is a rather interesting conversation at the moment. But people understand the need because we have to put the lights on. Resilience in the long term is that for me is sustainability. Because when we think about what is resilience, it's about working through challenge. It's about keep going even when you're faced with that challenge. And while that's very clear in the short term for our employees, in the long term, the question is, well, we've got Ukraine is still, even in the war, set a phase out timeline for the coal stations for 2035. So we need to be planning for what we're going to replace that capacity with. So a long term resilience for Ukraine and for DTEK is investing in renewables, building the future energy system. And so I think this is where resilience for me is the short term, what we see right now, but also it's preparing for that long term element.
And if you just sort of think about, obviously since you joined GTEC, how has that changed your frame of thinking around sustainability and the energy transition? Because you already sort of alluded to, look, you have to rebuild some of the core infrastructure simply because there's, a need for energy and there's just no quick alternative or solution there. But how are you thinking about about those themes differently now?
I think the main change that I've had since joining DTEC is being the reframing the conversation. So what we see is the outcome is the same. So we are looking at a renewable energy system. We're looking at a more decentralized energy system, one that is more resilient to attack. Um, while maybe 5 years ago in my role, I would have been looking at it from a carbon perspective. And now it is from a security perspective. It is from a resiliency perspective because renewables are harder to hit, and they're faster to fix. So just to give you an example, a power station, a coal power station can be taken out by a single missile. So 250, 300 megawatts out by one missile. You would need about 40 missiles to do the equivalent amount of capacity damage at a wind farm. So just by design, if renewables offer a more resilient and secure energy system than the energy system of the past. And so for me, the outcome is that same. We are still building a more renewable energy system, but the drivers and the reason and the way that we talk about it is now very different.
Yeah, very clear. And you're continuing also to invest despite the war, which is obviously a challenge because you have to deploy capital. You have to make sure that these are assets that most companies and most countries build with a 20, 30-year sort of time frame, right? In terms of being able to then also reap the benefits of that investment. Why does DTEK keep investing, and how do you think about those capital allocation decisions?
Yeah, I mean, the why for us is very much around needing to think about where that power is going to come from in the future. So it's both preparing um, for a post coal energy system, but it is also because having lived experience, the renewable systems are more resilient to attack. So we don't know when the war is going to end. We hope that it will end at any time soon. But given that uh, you know given the experience we've gone through and that our coal stations are constantly under attack and are a target for the Russians, we want to be able to build wind farms to be able to have a more secure power to the country at this time. So when we think about the capital allocation for us, it is very much looking at how do we start building that system now, a future energy system now. We can't wait for the end of the war for that to happen because we need to be able to have that more secure power flow sooner rather than later.
Yeah, so many lessons learned by the sounds of it. What lessons do you think are sort of generalizable to other global energy companies?
I think the two that would jump out is resilience by design. Um, and I think when we thought about resiliency in the past, it's usually redundancy is the main aspect of design, and redundancy is still something that needs to be there. But what we also need to be thinking about is on a system level. Um, if we are thinking about broader resiliency, there's different steps that energy companies can take. And renewables is one example of that, but it's also going to be decentralized, like decentralized power, so solar PV on rooftops, battery storage at multiple sites, sometimes smaller units rather than large ones, and then a smart grid and digital system that connects it all together. And so I think that's where this kind of having resilience and security at the center of the planning is a lesson that we are promoting to energy companies, to policymakers continually. I think the other element is the one I mentioned already, which is framing. So I have sustainability in my title. I try actively not to use that word because it's certain stakeholders that we're engaging with. They won't want to hear us talk about climate. They won't want to have us talk about green energy. And so being able to switch that narrative, we can still achieve those same goals. We can still talk about the same thing, but we're using words that are engaging with that particular audience. And I think that's a lesson that we are not the only ones doing that. I think a lot of us are starting to realize that just changing the narrative a little bit can allow us to continue the conversation.
Yeah, and I think that segues into a theme that I think is broadly relevant for a lot of folks in the room. Is that obviously in 2025, whether you were in the US or whether you were in Europe or other parts of the world, there has been quite a lot of pushback on ESG. I think the term ESG has become super politicized. Uh, I definitely have people come and ask me, but isn't sustainability dead? How can you still run a company around this? So how do you interpret those developments? And you already touched upon it a little bit, but looking at the EU Green Deal, looking at the omnibus, like how do you think about that?
Uh, I think there's a lot of noise. I think there's my LinkedIn blew up, I think like a lot of yours did about a year ago, with Omnibus being introduced. And there's a lot of noise, in my opinion, out there around the death of ESG. I would actually go interested to hear from others in terms of what they think, but from my perspective, um, I am still quite hopeful, and I'm still quite optimistic in terms of the future for sustainability, simply down to the fact that even with something as highly politicized as ESG at the moment, and we have an administration in the US that is pushing fossil fuels, it doesn't change the reality that there are climate risks that are becoming more expensive. It doesn't change the reality that the economics is still favorable for renewables. It doesn't change the reality that there are communities or there are people that are going to be impacted by bad um, business practice. And so, in that sense, sustainability still has a core role. What I think we're then confronted with is how is change being driven? And on CSRD in particular, my personal views, the EU is extremely ambitious, overly ambitious in what it was trying to achieve. And what happens when things like that happen? You sometimes got to say, you know what, we need to slow down. We need to find a better way of being able to move forward. For me, that is what Omnibus is. Omnibus is not a retrenchment; it is a recalibration of being able to say, is there a smarter way for us to drive this change? Because if what the EU is still standing by, they're still standing by the 2050 Green Deal. They are still standing by the commitment they have as a continent and as a governing body. They're just trying to find a smarter way of being able to do that as they have to balance the growth challenges and the broader societal challenges that they're also confronting. So yeah, for me, I'm still optimistic, but
Well, that's very good to hear. So so are we. And then catching on to that optimism and I guess other developments, right? So I think, the for the advent of AI is one of those things. But also I think what we're seeing more and more is that organizations are really trying to make that connection between their sustainability practices and value creations. I think 2025 was also the year where, folks said, look, having certain targets and, words isn't good enough. We need data and we need real progress to be able to sort of also defend why we're spending time, money, energy on this, which in practice, I think to your point is recalibration and not an unwelcome one for a lot of businesses. So, with all that in mind, what does the future what is the future role of sustainability leaders and the people here in the room from your perspective?
fighting the internal battle for driving change, I think, is the role for us. I mean, for I we were again, I was chatting with someone earlier today about there's different sustainability people. I've been doing this for a long time. I am a sustainability person, but there are also people who work in this field who are new to it or might have been, deep business professionals, say in marketing or strategy or finance, who are now migrated over. um, what I think they bring is this experience of having to run a business function that has to fight those internal political battles for resources and driving change like any business function needs to do. So I think what sustainability leaders need to do now is they're growing up. The function is growing up. The whole idea of ESG and sustainability has grown out, and that means that we are having to act like any other function, and that means fighting for resource, fighting for budget, fighting for time at the board, and that is for those leaders, it's almost accepting that, and I think that's a again, sorry to use the J word, journey that we as those of us who've been in this field for a long time have had to come to accept. It's a we've always been kind of in the past shouting from outside the room,
Yeah.
and now we are inside the room, but that comes with a responsibility of having to start doing those same types of battles that the rest of the rest of the functional heads need to do.
Yeah, and I think, you've already touched on this, but I think where we wanted to wrap it up and then also sort of like open up to some questions from the audience was sort of, you know, uh, whether you're optimistic about the future of sustainability, yes or no. And the answer is yes. Maybe sort of thinking about sort of 20 years from now, where do you think we should be?
I think in 20 years from now, that's a good question. I think in 20 years from now, I actually so there I'm gonna answer in a different way. So there are some in my role that have the idea, and I used to believe this to be honest, about 10, 15 years ago, that the role of a head of sustainability was to work themselves out of a job. Um, I don't believe that anymore, and I think actually, where I would see in 20 years more businesses being kind of like where my team is at the moment. And what I mean by this is the business case for certain industries and certain companies for sustainability is much clearer than it is for others. So for DTEK, we must have a very central focus on sustainability because it is needed for us to be able to attract financing. Um, and so the business case is quite straightforward. And so there needs to be teams who are able to navigate that space, articulate that at a board level, scale systems to be able to operate efficiently, just like other functions, kind of like I was saying before. For other businesses, it's not as clear cut. It's not as straightforward. But I think in 20 years, the challenges that businesses will face, that society will face, um, even just only alone through the lens of climate change, will be more pronounced and it will be clear for. And so, what I'm saying is the business case for more companies will be clear. And so, I think in 20 years, where it's going to be is you're going to have lean teams operating at board level that are delivering programs that are central to the core business. So I think it'll be stronger, it'll be more embedded. It might be lean. It'll be more existing across the organization.
Uh, Interesting. And with that, wanted to make sure we also leave some time for questions from the audience. I'm not timekeeping. I'm looking at. Yeah, we're doing good, Femke. Okay, great, cool. Uh, so yeah. Any questions for Jeff?
That's a question. Um, Might be a silly question, but you mentioned this tension between rebuilding existing coal power stations, but still continuing to invest in other renewables. Is that just because the coal infrastructure exists already and you can immediately plug into it and get power back to people? Is that why you're still kind of investing in that as an outlet? Why?
In short, yes. But I think the other element of that is the market, who's then going to provide the capital, will look at what is the cheapest way of getting megawatts back online, and that will always be to rebuild an existing asset. So yeah, when you're looking at it on a very short term basis, it comes down to the cost per megawatt.
The rabbit question. It goes to the investment, right? So you're capturing investment from very external to Ukraine. How do you do due diligence? So it's to get you to actually go and have a look at your sites. That's normally a core part of due diligence is site visits. So they would sort of be the war period on how does that look?
So site visits still happen. So we'll frequently run. It's usually delegations out to particular sites to show them. They might not be able to get to all sites, but they will be getting to some. And yeah, it's you'd be surprised. There's still a lot of travel going on. Yeah,
I mean, mail will be well, the impression that we can't really go.
it's just a lot longer to get there because you can't fly, so you have to travel by train. But yeah, there's still trips going. Not as many people you count. It takes a certain mindset for someone to go into Ukraine at the moment, if you're not Ukrainian.
Other questions from the audience? Don't be shy. Well, I have a question. Um, one that we hadn't scripted. How do you sort of think about technology in terms of helping your team? So how, because we're obviously we work with your team. How does software AI make a difference to your team's work?
Yeah. So the first is efficiency and productivity. I think in that sense, for software like yours, I see productivity coming in that you're giving. So the way that we structure, I have a small central team, and then we've got sustainability leads in each of our businesses. And those sustainability leads in each business then needs to engage their functions and teams across each of their business. So there's a lot of stakeholders who won't have a lot of connection to the topics that we're wanting to talk about. And I think it's through systems like yours that when they can go onto it and there's the opportunity of just having access to that information when they're in that moment is quite helpful. Because when we run our traditional training programs, you get everyone in a room like this and you run through the topic and they're kind of nodding along and then they go back to their jobs and they're thinking, gosh, what does that mean in terms of me now sitting and doing this particular task? But I think what the software does is it puts the information to someone at the moment that they need it. So I think that helps awareness, but it also then ultimately helps productivity. I think the other piece is standardization. So again, in a business so decentralized as ours, and separate, uh, being able to ensure that the metrics are having the same definition, having the same calculation methodology, is really important and challenging. And so the system enables us to scale that more easily. I think on the AI front, I still think that's quite early days. I see, at least for my team and it is around kind of just productivity within very narrow workflows. So communication, kind of dealing with large amounts of information, summarizing it, things like that. But I think the question for me is over the next 2 to 5 years, what is the opportunity going to be with AI? But there's lots of ideas that I know that you guys will have that we have in terms of using that for data modeling and forecasting emissions and being able to make it simpler for certain teams to navigate that space. Um, but I think that's kind of the tip of the iceberg. I think there'll be a lot more than that.
Yeah, and we'll definitely have Robin Hussein speak about that and what we're currently cooking up and what we already have cooked up a little bit later. And just remind me, how many sites are you currently collecting data for? Because you guys are obviously, it's a large business.
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. No, no, no. So
That number is too big. So I think the in terms of businesses, we've got 8, and then across the big sites, the power stations will be kind of in the tens. But then when we multiply that out by substations, we multiply that out by offices, you get quickly into the high hundreds.
yeah,
So yeah, there's a lot.
yeah. And then of course it helps a lot to do that sort of
Yeah.
digitally on software.
Can I ask a question of the crowd?
Yeah, of course.
I'm going to turn it back on you all. Um, How optimistic or pessimistic are you on sustainability and ESG future? So let's do a show of hands. Who's optimistic? Okay. And who's pessimistic? There's got to be brave enough people. We're not. You're not. You're in a friendly room. Well, that's very pleasing that you're all on the optimistic side. That means that you've also kind of seen through the noise on your LinkedIn pages, which is heartening.
Great. And then we're gonna sort of go into our first breakout session. I think Natalie, you were gonna quickly sort of provide everybody with a few instructions about the sessions, right? Exactly. Thank you so much, Jen. Really a pleasure to have you on stage. Thank you.